So thanks to Sixt for having me to another great conference at this lovely museum. I'd like to start with a quick explanation, as I had intended to cover the use of both forms of close combat weapon of the British Cavalry in the official fight books that accompanied them, but to do so in the time soon proved impossible. So I hope you'll forgive me for just covering those relating to swords this time and leaving lance drills to one side. But I have recently written a book that touches on this subject, so hopefully that might excuse me using the time today to concentrate on the sword and the sword drills. So until the late 18th century, there had been no centrally standardised system for the use of edge weapons in the British Cavalry. This is despite the fact that since the formation of the modern British Army in the mid-17th century, edge weapons were the cavalry's main battlefield weapon. So swordsmanship, as well as the precise types of swords to be used, were determined at regimental level. So in addition to the great variety of sword types that could have been used by the British Cavalry in the 18th century, there could have been a similar variety in their methods of use, as determined by the preferences of each regiment's colonel and master-at-arms. But this was to change as the result of the efforts of John Gaspard Le Marchant. Le Marchant was a scientific soldier who was obsessed with improving the efficiency of the British Army. Amongst his achievements, and the most important in fight book terms, was his 1796 Rules and Regulations for the Sword Exercise of the Cavalry. By making use of his royal patronage, Le Marchant was able to have his exercise approved and centrally issued, providing the whole of the British Cavalry with their first specific treatise on swordsmanship, their first centrally standardised fight book. The majority of pupils that would be taught Le Marchant's system would be enlisted men with little or no experience of swordsmanship, and the exercise gets straight to turning such men into swordsmen, and after very briefly outlining the principles of the system to instructors, the recruit is immediately ready for training. The pupil is to stand square on, simulating the straight-legged riding style of the period. The sword drills are first taught on foot, but as the British Cavalry were expected to only really use their swords when mounted, only movements that can be replicated in the saddle are allowed. On a wall, a target showing the 6 cuts is drawn. All cuts are carried out from the guard position, with the hilt held in front of the face with an outstretched arm. The cuts are then practiced singly, each comprising 3 or 4 movements, which ends by bringing the sword back to the guard. After mastering the individual cuts, a short section outlines how to string the cuts together collectively. 8 guards are dealt with next. Left and right protect involve carrying the blade across the body with a straight arm and changing grip so the flat of the blade is used to parry with. This is not thought necessary with the other guards, which are presumably made with the edge. Although thrusts are an area of much less importance, it being recommended they only be used against a retiring enemy or their flank, 3 points make up the last individual elements of the system. These all require a change of grip, made possible by the new swords that accompanied the exercise. Yet even on these occasions that recruits are to thrust, these are always accompanied by at least 1 additional cut, further stressing how much of a cut-based system this is. The next section, sword exercise on foot, sees recruits perform a series of action known as a division. Most of the 6 divisions begin with cuts 1 to 6 as the first action, representing the crucial charge, followed by a set series of motions appropriate to the theoretical combat situation. These include fail attacks against cavalry, defences against multiple opponents in a melee, and various actions against infantry. Confusingly, though, these divisions introduce 2 new parries, thigh protect and left parry, motions which are only illustrated and not described. Once mastered on foot, recruits are mounted and the 6 divisions are performed at the walk, with some extra commentary on equestrian matters and body position. Subsequent stages involve performing the motions while moving in a circle, representing the constant turning of the cavalry melee, before increasing speed. Only then are recruits introduced to specific targets, by running at the rings to practice points and the edge posts for cuts, it being recommended that a series of these at different heights and sides be laid out on a course to practice against. Finally, opposition is introduced, with mounted recruits facing off against each other. They form line, the main cavalry formation throughout the period, and make 2 divisions of prescribed attacks with matching defences before performing a final simulation of the pursuit. So now to move to the practical and weapons context of this fight book. As I have argued here before, the 1796 light cavalry sword seems to have been specifically designed for this fight book system of swordsmanship. So it is possible, with the necessary attention paid to the suppling of the wrist, that this sword could be used successfully with this system, where the wrist, 2nd, 3rd and 4th finger provide impetus to the cut. but it's difficult to see how such a system of wrist cuts could be effective with the much heavier and differently balanced heavy cavalry sword. This is not to say that the heavy cavalry sword could not be used successfully with the system. Sergeant Hewitt's evidence from Waterloo recounts a series of cuts that could be straight from the exercise. But Hewitt was 6'4", his regiment's master at arms had almost 20 years of service to master such a system. Certainly those contemporary accounts that go into sufficient detail suggest that in practice cuts were not always delivered from the wrist alone, even when facing cavalry. Such an unnatural system must have been hard to keep to in the heat of combat, so we have French accounts of British cavalry attacking with wild swings rather than controlled cuts. And yet the combination of swords and system do seem to have been relatively successful. Although in cavalry combat there are so many variables that determine success, there were a few occasions that suggest the 1796 sword and exercise did combine to provide success on the battlefield. Frequently when British cavalry bested their French counterparts, it was not following the shock of the charge, but in the melee when swordsmanship was most likely to tell. But whilst the 1796 exercise did persist for the revolutionary and Napoleonic period, it was not without its critics. At Waterloo, officers of the Household Brigade criticised the guard position as unnecessarily tiring, and others spoke of the difficulty of trying to parry French thrusts by the long action of taking right or left protect from the guard. So perhaps it's not surprising that an established system was maintained during a period of war, but with time for reform in peace, the 1796 exercise was soon replaced. But the changing of the system should not be solely attributed to perceived faults in the old exercise, or even the existence of a necessarily improved system, but was probably again influenced by royal preferences. By 1816, Henry Charles Angelo had, at royal appointment, been teaching sword exercise to British infantry NCOs and also to the royal favourite Captain Peters, the officer whose lance exercise met with royal approval. His father, Henry Anglo, had also come to royal attention by slightly reworking Le Marchant's 1796 exercise as Hungarian and Highland broadsword for the rich and well-connected light horse volunteers of London and Westminster. And it was Henry Charles who was looked to provide the next cavalry fight book, the 1819 Cavalry Sword Exercise. This system was very different to the 1796 exercise. The only real similarity lies in the stages of the recruit's progress. But in terms of fundamentals of sword use, rather than the structure of the manual, Angelo's system was a great change. He completely does away with the reliance on wrist cuts, no longer has cuts performed with the straight arm, and reassesses the primacy of the cut over the thrust. The 1819 exercise relies on a diagram to outline the fundamentals, but goes into greater detail than its predecessor, which only outlined the cuts. His system involves 7 cuts, the new direction being a vertical line down the centre, 7 numbered guards, 3 points, and 2 parries. Cuts are made along the solid lines, with the guards shown by the sword hilts and the hatch lines. Of the 3 points, the first and third are made with the fingernails down, with the second point made in the same line as the first, but with the nails up. The cuts are mostly delivered from the elbow and shoulder, with advice on cutting centering on keeping the middle knuckles in line with the edge of the blade and concentrating the acceleration and power of the movement to the final stage of a cut's delivery. Thrusts are no longer limited to pursuit, but are fully incorporated within the assault as a method of attack of at least equal importance to the cut. In addition to the 7 numbered guards, there's also a right and left guard and 2 circular parries to defend the rear. These numbered guards and parries are absent from the diagram and are only illustrated in the yeomanry version of 1835. Further differences include the introduction of feints, something only mentioned just once in passing in the 1796 exercise, and other methods of cutting are also suggested, such as a draw and push cut. Free play between recruits using single sticks is also encouraged. What is noteworthy is the similarity of this exercise to Angelo's 1817 infantry sword exercise. It seems that he simply copied over this exercise, designed for a very different type of sword and sword combat. But considering the lineage of Angelo and his experience in small sword fencing, perhaps this should not be surprising. So a great deal of the exercise is dedicated to dismounted techniques, such as lunging, foot stamping, turning the body to one side, or shifting the leg. All movements carried out from the modern fencing on guard stance, a position clearly impossible when astride a horse. Only when it comes to the mounted parts of the drill is this addressed, with recruits then having to perform certain actions, particularly the thrusts, in a very different way, now keeping the body square, bending from the waist and starting from a different position of engage. So the swords carried by the British Cavalry when the 1819 exercise was issued were still the 1796 light and heavy cavalry patterns, neither of which were well suited for the new exercise, being far better for the cut-based system they were adopted for. But in 1821, new pattern swords were approved, and these were certainly more suited to the 1819 exercise, and it is possible that their design was a response to the new system of swordsmanship, with their approval probably coming from the King rather than from the Board of Ordnance. For the next 40 years, Angelo's fight book was to remain in place with the British Cavalry completely unchanged, and it was this drill that was used by the Heavy Brigade at the Battle of Balaclava during their less famous but far more successful charge than their comrades in the Light Brigade. Although Russian inaction and a British flank attack probably had at least as much to do with its success, the role of swordsmanship should not be dismissed, as this charge was carried out at no more than a trot. Without having the momentum of the charge to win the combat on contact, that the British proceeded to best their considerably more numerous opponents for 10 minutes of melee before routing them can perhaps be taken as some vindication of Angelo's drill, or at least their competence in it. It seems that at least cut 7 of the drill was effective, as doctors tending the wounded remarked upon the numbers of Russian dead who had had their headdresses and skulls divided down to the chin. It also seems that many points were landed with the thrust of the system, it being said that despite good thrusts, some blades bent and were unable to penetrate. That the success of this action may have been in part due to the sword exercise is reinforced by the clear adherence regiments paid to it. After the charge, a doctor asked a British dragoon how he came by his head wound. So indoctrinated was he by the set plays of the system, he replied, "I had just given cut 5 at a Russian, and the damn fool never got it at all, but gave me cut 7. But this exercise was soon revised after the Crimean War, and by 1858 a new combined sword, lance and field gun drill was issued, which did away with Angelo's diagram of cuts, parries and guards. Instead, the system changed to 8 cuts, 8 guards and 8 points, and although greater in number, this was in fact a simplification, with a cut, guard and point, both low and high, front and back, on each side. Other elements of the fight book remained unchanged. The structure was similar and the general observations were taken verbatim. But the section in free training in swordsmanship outside of the set sequences was now gone. The sword that was in service when the new exercise was issued can perhaps be seen to reflect once again a shift to stress the point over the cut, as in the new drill. The grip was slightly cocked and quite rounded, so was more conducive to thrusting than cutting. The grip construction with its full width tang, although patented as the new Reeve solid tang in 1853, will be familiar to Messer fans. In 1864, a bowl guard was substituted, and this general form of hilt, grip and blade was maintained for all 5 subsequent pattern swords, with even the 6th not being too different. It was these different patterns of swords that were continually criticised, tested and revised. This went in a circle of lightening or strengthening blades as complaints came in about the weapon's poor handling or lack of durability respectively. For it was the swords themselves, rather than their use, that was looked to for solutions. Hence a series of sword surveys, tests, trials and reviews were conducted in the second half of the 19th century. But when properly applied, most of the criticised patterns of swords could perform well, as proven by the 1890 test cutting experiment, one of which involved a skilled cavalryman riding with a regulation cavalry sword at a slung-up horse carcass. In one of these tests, he succeeded in fracturing the horse's tibia with a single cut without damaging the sword at all. So it seems strange that throughout this period, the one constant, the drill, of how to use these swords was not looked to for revision. But there were soldiers who thought it, or at least a sufficient competence in it, lacking. In 1866, one complained that in the cavalry, the skills of polishing a scabbard until you could see to shave in it was a thought of more importance than dexterity in the use of the sword itself. When still a young cavalry officer in India, Baden-Powell went further. In order to open up the eyes of his men to the range of mounted swordplay that existed beyond the drill, he employed the services of Indian swordsmen, which fully exposed the limits of the contemporary British sword drill. But what is perhaps most remarkable is the context of wider developments in weapons technology that provided the backdrop to the swords and swordsmanship of the British cavalry during the second half of the 19th century. This was a period of unparalleled advances in firearms technology, advances that some saw the cavalry, with their love of the arme blanche, as completely blind to. Already by the 1850s, the Minié bullet provided the infantryman with, in a weapon such as the Enfield rifled musket, a firearm that could be shot as fast as a smoothbore with the accuracy of a rifle at ranges beyond the human eye, with its percussion cap providing greater reliability. Things rapidly accelerated with the development of the self-contained cartridge, with the Snyder Enfield in the 1860s increasing rate of fire from 3 to 8 rounds a minute and further improving reliability. The Martini Henry of the 1870s again increased rate of fire up to 12 rounds a minute, and with the advent of smokeless powder and bolt-action magazine-fed rifles, such as the Lee Metford in the late 1880s, firearms technology has improved little since. By the 1890s, well-trained infantry could shoot as many aimed rounds in a minute as is still practical today, while smaller, faster ammunition with flatter trajectories made effective shooting at long range more practical than before. And yet, during these periods of rapid development, the British cavalry, like their European counterparts, continue to consider their singular purpose the mounted charge with swords drawn, dedicating as much as 4/5 of their training times to such drills and manoeuvre. But such a lack of change was not purely born of conservatism. Most modern wars gave enough evidence for both sides of the argument to make their cases, those that believed cavalry should abandon the sword in favour of the rifle, and those that still thought the cold steel charge irreplaceable, if increasingly dangerous. Despite modern firearms and artillery, the sword and sword drill still seem to have a place. But this view was challenged during the Second South African War. The British Army was led by Lord Roberts, who believed mounted infantry armed with the rifle alone and not trained to fight from the saddle should replace true edge-weapon armed cavalry. Although the sword was only withdrawn temporarily and piecemeal, the lance was abolished in 1903, with drill manuals now stating the rifle, not the sword, was the principal weapon of the cavalry. This seemingly brought an end to the British Army's arme blanche debate and to sword-armed and drilled cavalry. The success of the Roberts Ring in eroding the cavalry's dash was so successful that by 1904 the British cavalry were without confidence and purpose. But with Sir John French's appointment, a career cavalryman, an extraordinary about-turn happened. His 1907 cavalry regulation stated, "It must be accepted that the rifle, effective as it is, cannot replace the devastation produced on the enemy by the speed of the horse, the magnetism of the charge, and the terror of cold steel." With the cavalry reinvigorated, they needed a new weapon to replace the 1899 pattern sword that had been found wanting on the few occasions it saw use in South Africa. The new sword was to receive a far more scientific birth than its predecessors. The work of two successive committees involved senior cavalrymen such as Sir Douglas Haig, Sir John French, and also the renowned fencer Alfred Hutton. The committees decided the new sword should be exclusively for thrusting, and it went through many experimental patterns before finally being approved. This sword, the pattern 1908, was such a departure from previous models that it was decided a new accompanying sword exercise was needed, which was incorporated into the new cavalry training manual of 1912. Whereas previous changes to the sword exercise had still retained much of the principles and messages of 1819, there was almost nothing left of Angelo's work in the new sword drill. 3 parries replaced the previous 8, these being left and right, both done with a straight arm, and a head parry. The particulars of the sword itself, in this case the large protective bowl guard, were to be used in finally bringing attacks to rest. Again, to fully comply with the design of the new sword, instead of outlining different methods of attack, only the point was taught. When giving point, the hand was to be inverted, having the little finger uppermost and the back of the hand to the left. To the extreme simplicity of the new drill was added some more technical elements by the inclusion of feints, disengagements, and deviations of the opponent's blade. But fundamentally, the drill is all about keeping one's own point on target and diverting the opponent's. There is also a greater emphasis placed on mounted free play, rather than learning a greater number of different attacks and defences. In all mounted drills, recruits were to constantly move at the gallop, with even group combats being stopped after a maximum of 2 minutes. This realisation that speed was of the essence, even in a melee against cavalry, and the emphasis in other parts of the manual on rapid, small unit attacks reflects the progressive journey the British cavalry had made in securing a practical role in the context of modern warfare. Some countries' cavalry struggled to adapt to the context of modern warfare. either choosing to willfully ignore advances in weapon technology or tended to overemphasize its practical effect and be paralysed in the face of firepower. In contrast, the British cavalry were quite successful in developing a form of hybrid cavalry, equally at home in the saddle with the sword or on foot with the rifle. As such, the First World War saw the new sword and new drill employed successfully when it is called upon, with the combination even accounting for the first British kill of the war. And it was through this wider change in overall cavalry doctrine in the context of modern war that the fight books of the British cavalry, as in those elements of the drill which specifically dealt with the use of edged weapons in practical combat situations, survived into the early 20th century. Although opportunities for mounted action proved increasingly rare, the tactical option for cavalry to occasionally charge with swords and to be properly trained in the use of such weapons in melee was still militarily valid enough to ensure the survival of sword-armed and drill cavalry right until the disappearance of the horse soldier from the battlefield. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Questions?
Thank you for the talk.
Thank you.
You use different names. You use fight books.
I knew you'd pick up that, yeah.
Training manuals and
Yeah.
training manuals.
Yeah.
Do you think it would be interesting to use them for specific branches?
I think, well, hearing your talk today, I did think, oh, yes, I should have done that. But, so I'm glad, you raised it, and I was going to go back and maybe do it for the written version. But in some cases, it's what they're officially called, of course. But, yeah, I think applying, your terminology you outlined this morning would be useful. Although, in some cases, like with the later drills, they're in a wider book on cavalry training, even sometimes including musket drills and stuff like that. But for the purposes of this, and 6's definition, I just wanted to isolate the edge weapon bit. But no, it's definitely something I'll be considering after your excellent talk. Thanks.
I have a question. Do we know if the soldiers training in the 19th century is under any of these fight books, whatever you would call it? When the training was mostly geared towards fighting on horseback, and they trained mostly like this, do we know if they were also training then for themselves, fencing on foot? Like, did they see the necessity, or were they so obsessed with a cavalry fighting that they said, well, it's necessary for us, we don't need to fight on foot?
Well, that last statement is kind of the attitude of Le Marchand. There's nothing that can be replicated unless it's mounted, covered. You're not allowed in lunges, blah, blah, blah. But with Angelo's one, at least a third of it is dismounted. Dismounted work, dismounted like, modern sport fencing work, effectively. And you get that going right through, bizarrely, even up to the final one, the 1912 one. It still has, they still learn them with lunging on foot, even though, by this period, as soon as you dismount, you've got your rifle, and your sword actually only lives on your horse. So I think, in a sense, they're doing it more as exercise, physical exercise, rather than expecting to use their swords dismounted. Because even at the beginning of this period, late 18th century, British cavalry are like dragoons in name only. It's not like in other countries where they're still expected to occasionally fight dismounted. There's so few British cavalry compared to the rest of the army and compared to the rest of the European nations that they're only ever deployed mounted, really.
In terms of production of these books and manuals, were these something that officers who are instructing officers would have a copy of for reference, or did soldiers ever actually look through these?
So this one, a copy, when it first came out, a copy got sent to each regiment, and in fact they sent out NCOs to take construction alongside the manual and then go back to their respective regiments to pass that knowledge on with the manual. So in most cases, people doing the instruction are non-commissioned officers rather than officers. But these are issued by what eventually became the War Department. So they're printed and issued by the government. You could buy private versions as well, like the yeomanry version with all the nice pictures. There's no pictures in the 1819 one, apart from that diagram. So all these are taken from the yeomanry version, which would be privately purchased by like volunteer gentlemen cavalry, territorials. They don't leave the country. So these would be privately purchased, but the other ones would be issued.
This might be a little bit off topic, but I was curious how similar are the sword techniques that artillery units are using? Because those guys were mounted, weren't they?
Yeah, so Royal Horse Artillery at this time, they basically used the light cavalry sword, yeah? So they used this bottom one until it's replaced with that one. And then they basically still use a version of that today, but with a straighter blade, so they stick with that sort of sword. In terms of whether they were actually drilled, I don't know. There's certainly not a special book for drilling of artillerymen in sword play. And there's not one for the infantry sword exercise is aimed at NCO, so presumably, artillery, foot artillery would use the infantry sword, and presumably horse artillery would use, but I can't imagine them devoting that much time to it, because horse artillery is a relatively new science at this beginning, so they've got bigger things to fly, I imagine.
I was doing something totally different, and I came across in a little artilleryman's book.
Cool.
And it had a section of sword
really?
exercises in there.
Was it a US one?
No, this is British.
Right.
And it was a numbered system, and I didn't pay much attention to it until, later on that week I came across someone who had kind of a fetish for artillery.
Right.
He was using a numbered system in his description. I was wondering.
It's probably sword, field gun, and lance drill or whatever. For the mid 19th century, that's numbered, and horse artillery would use it for their galloper guns. So sorry, that's the answer.
I wonder if these regulations at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, were also introduced into cavalry units from the Dominions. Reason for my question is that New Zealand and Australian cavalry played a decisive role in the Middle East.
In the First World War?
Yes.
Yes, they did. They were mainly mounted rifles, and interestingly, actually, towards the end of that war, they petitioned the British to be allowed to be equipped with swords.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Because they'd, of course, the Australians at a place called Bathsheba had conducted their mounted rifles, so not armed with swords, or trained it, and they conducted a very famous, sort of parodied in a horrible Mel Gibson film, actually, charge against Turkish trenches and taking them with bayonets. And after that, there was calls, and they eventually got issued with their swords. This one, yeah. But the Indians used slightly different swords until right at the end they got a version of that, slightly smaller grip, because Indian soldiers were thought to be slightly smaller. But for most of the period, they used Indian soldiers in British service used something very similar to the 1796 that. But they're issued by different kingdoms, so there's a great variety. But up until 1912, they had a different sword drill, which was still, all cut-based using a sword like this, basically.
Last question. One question. We have a lot of changes in the system as well as in the blade structure. So, do you have any records of people who are opposing these changes who say, well, I like the 1796 best, so let's keep it? So, or maybe requests, so can I keep another different ones?
They come afterwards during, you particularly get them after the Royal United Service Institute is set up in about the 1830s, where officers get together and discuss things. So you only get commentary on these ones from like people's war diaries, so it'll be quite a personal experience, sometimes complaining that it's broken or something like that. But certainly this sword is prized in those terms for a good 60 years later, especially in India. And there are some chaps in the First World War who refused the issue of officers, of course, because enlisted man, you've got to do it, officers buy their own swords. So who did still use this one, which, a lot of people tell you it's the worst British cavalry sword ever, but there are people on active service in the First World War who chose to still keep that. So yeah, if there is, I mean, if you're an officer, you've got a bit more leeway. Yeah, but there's also pages and pages of documents from the Board of Ordnance from about the 1850s onwards of these various tests and do we temper it in oil or water, and the stuff from Solingen's no good because the Birmingham cutlers want to, up their trade. So there's all sorts of wrangles. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you.